Hi everyone. I hope you're all doing great on this lovely spring afternoon. It's about 23 degrees here in London, which is pretty amazing. And so I would definitely recommend to open up the windows, have some fresh air flowing, maybe make sure to take your hay fever medicine and sit back to enjoy your webinar. So my name is Gaël Tiampon, and I will be your host today. I'm head of marketing at Rize ETF, and I'd like to say welcome. Welcome to our Rize webinar series. And thank you for attending today's session that will be about the sustainable future of food theme and our award-winning ETF. Before we begin today's presentation, I will quickly address some housekeeping just to make sure that you get the best experience during the webinar. First, please note that we have left time in the end to address any questions. If you would like to ask a question during the webinar, I would recommend it to type it directly into the Q&A panel so you don't forget it, and we will seek to address it at the end of the webinar. If you're famous and don't want us to ask for an autograph at the end of the webinar, don't worry. You can also submit your questions anonymously. Second, please note that there is a button in the control panel to raise your hand for any technical issues. If you are having any display or any sound issues, please raise your hand and I will get in touch to try and resolve it. All too often, I've noticed that the best solution is just to turn your Zoom app off and on again. Lastly, we are going to be distributing the presentation slides after the webinar is finished, as well as the recording. The webinar is also registered with the financial planner in Germany, so please do send me an email after the webinar in order to receive your certificate of attendance. So great, so now we can move on to the interesting stuff. On today's agenda, we're going to start with an introduction about the sustainable future of food theme. Then we'll move on to the future of this theme with the drivers of change and future opportunities. Finally, we'll present our ETF and finish up the webinar with a Q&A session. Regarding the speakers, I'm joined here today by Raoul Bouchon and Stuart Fort, who are both co-founders here at Rize ETF. So without further ado, let me hand the mic to Stuart and let's begin our webinar.
Thanks, Gail, and welcome everybody to this introduction to the Sustainable Future of Food investment theme. The food system. So the food system is a complex web of activities involving the production, processing, transport, and consumption of food. And the security of our food production and distribution systems is one of the world's most pressing challenges. Why is that? Well, because on the one hand, we have the challenge of providing healthy, affordable, and nutritious food to a growing global population. And on the other hand, we are faced with a rapidly changing climate and the major degradation of the natural environment and biodiversity. Ultimately, however, change has to start with the consumer, as that is really where the power lays in this whole thing. And consumers around the world are becoming better and better informed about both the environmental and, importantly, health impacts of what they're eating. Consumers, too, have become more concerned about nutritional value of what they're eating, as well as the safety and the provenance of what they're eating. Like the challenges we face with global energy, the global food system requires an urgent transformation if we want to avoid the sorts of irreversible planetary damage that await if we do nothing. So in the same way that we talk about the energy transition, we must talk about the food transition, i.e. the transition to a sustainable future of food. We are nowhere near there yet. The good news is that such a system-wide and large-scale change creates new investment opportunities. In this case, those opportunities include companies that are innovating across the food value chain to build a more sustainable and secure food system for our planet, and ultimately deliver what the modern climate-conscious consumer is demanding. So the current state of food, and why is it unsustainable? We'd like to spend a little bit of time just elaborating on the current state of the food supply chain and why it is unsustainable. Here you will see that we have laid out a series of statistics for you to consider. You'll note that food accounts for 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Half of the world's habitable land, barring ice and deserts, is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater is used for agriculture. 78% of global ocean and freshwater eutrophication is caused by agriculture. And 94% of the Earth's mammal biomass is comprised of livestock. And now for the most important statistic of all, meat production. It accounts for 14.5% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions. That is massive when you consider that that is 14.5% of everything, right? Including all of the emissions from fossil fuels. 77% of agricultural land is actually used for grazing livestock or for producing animal feed. And 80% of all the soy that's produced in the world is used for feeding animals, not humans. Cattle ranching is also the #1 driver of deforestation in the Amazon region. So what do all these statistics tell us? They tell us that food lies at the very heart of trying to tackle climate change, deal with water scarcity, reduce pollution, and prevent the further loss of forests and biodiversity. So let's take a look at the greenhouse gas emissions across the food system. On the previous slides, I pointed out a number of statistics that highlight the unsustainability of our existing food system. So carbon emissions, the loss of forests, biodiversity, water scarcity, etc. Now, whilst all of these consequences are interlinked, they are all distinct and separate environmental outcomes, each of which arise out of different points in the food supply chain, from production all the way down to consumption. So what we'd like to do is spend a couple of minutes drilling down into carbon emissions specifically. We're all very aware of the emissions from fossil fuels and the pressing need for a transition to renewables, electric cars, etc. However, people are far less familiar with the degree of emissions coming from our food system. The food system, as highlighted on the previous slides, contributes between 20 and 30% of global human-made greenhouse gas emissions. The major impacts come from agriculture and land use change, with fertilizers, pesticides, manure farming, and land use change together contributing as much as 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As previously mentioned, livestock production alone contributes 14.5% of all emissions. Stages that are actually later in the food system, such as packaging, retail, transport, processing, food preparation, these only contribute about 5 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So they are much smaller in comparison, but you know their importance is expected to rise over time. So please take a moment just to consider this graphic that we've laid out here. This is a breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions per food type, right? So all the different food types, and then the various stages of the food supply chain. On the vertical axis, you have the different food types, for example, beef, coffee, root vegetables. And on the horizontal axis, you have the different stages of the food supply chain, for example, farming, processing, and transportation. What is immediately obvious is that the emissions from animal products significantly outweigh the emissions from plant-based products, which are as much as 10 to 15 times lower than animal-based products. However, the most staggering thing of all are the emissions from beef. There are two major factors driving the emissions in beef production. These are land use change. And when I say land use change, what I mean is deforestation. So you're converting the natural habitat into cattle ranching territory. And this deforestation is rife in places like the Amazon region of Brazil. And so deforestation is the #1 cause. Methane emissions is the second. Now, the reason why emissions from beef and lamb are so prolific is because these animals are ruminant animals, right? They use a process called enteric fermentation to digest their food, which is where microbes effectively decompose and ferment the food in a special fermentation compartment of the stomach called the rumen. A significant amount of methane is produced by the bacteria within the stomach during this fermentation process. So that's why we have so much methane coming from these animals. Again, you'll note that farming and land use change, i.e. deforestation, are responsible for the majority of emissions, whereas the later stages of the food supply chain, such as transportation, retail, and packaging, are negligible in comparison. And you can see them on the chart, you know, the sort of blues, the purple, and the pink. So eating local, it's one of the biggest misconceptions commonly touted in terms of doing your bit for climate change in the environment. We're really missing a trick there. You can see from the data that the emissions from transportation make up a tiny fraction of the total emissions from food. So eating local has many benefits, including supporting local farmers, etc. But reducing your carbon footprint is not one of them if you're not reducing the amount of meat that you're eating. So what you eat is actually far more important than where your food has come from. So what are the key the key takeaways from the emissions data? So these are some things that you can share with your friends and family tonight. The next time you're feeling conscientious in the supermarket, just remember that buying a locally produced steak is, relatively speaking, far worse than buying a piece of fruit that's traveled 5,500 miles across the world. So what is a sustainable food system? A sustainable food system is one that delivers food security and nutrition for all in such a way that the economic, social, and environmental bases to generate food security and nutrition for future generations are not compromised. Accordingly, a sustainable food system must be three things. Firstly, it has to be profitable, right? It's got to be economically sustainable. Secondly, it must also have broad-based benefits for society as a whole, i.e. securing social sustainability. And thirdly, it must have a positive or neutral impact on the natural environment, thereby safeguarding the sustainability of the natural environment. A sustainable food system lies at the very heart of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, i.e. the SDGs. These were adopted in 2015, and they call for major transformations in agriculture and food systems in order to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition by 2030. To realize the SDGs, the global food system needs to be reshaped to be more productive, more inclusive of poor and marginalized populations, environmentally sustainable and resilient, and able to deliver healthy and nutritious diets to everybody. These are complex and systemic challenges that require the combination of interconnected actions at the local, national, regional, and global levels. So the future of food. What are the drivers of change and opportunities? Where's the innovation coming, and what are the drivers of that? The companies that are driving the technological innovation across the food value chain and the companies that are designing and producing the new food products that climate conscious consumers are demanding are going to be the companies that are best positioned to benefit from the positive economic tailwinds of the food transition. So plant-based meats, cellular meats, big data in agriculture, biological solutions in agriculture, land-based fish farming, algae aquaculture. These are some of the innovations that you are going to see coming to your farm and plate in the very near future. Over the past few years, we've seen an explosion in funding for agri-food startups. Agri-food startups raised $26.1 billion in 2020. That's a 15.5% year-over-year increase compared with 2019. And that's actually expected to increase as some of the later deals get announced. So we think that may end up at about $30 billion for 2020, which would be a 35% growth over 2019. And we're starting to see more and more of these companies join the public equity markets. Everyone has heard the Beyond Meat story. So they sell pea-based substitutes and meat substitutes and have had the highest profile IPO in the agri-food sector in recent times. They really went a long way to putting the food sector in the spotlight for public market investors. Another plant-based food company that you may be less familiar with is Else Nutrition, which IPO'd in 2019, who produced plant-based baby food using all natural and clean ingredients. We have also recently seen App Harvest, an indoor farming company, complete its entry to the public markets via a SPAC deal. And Aero Farms, Another vertical farming company has just recently announced its intention to complete a SPAC deal. And rumors continue to persist that Impossible Foods might be considering an IPO in 2021. So what is driving this transition to a more sustainable food system and the associated innovation? It all starts with the consumers. With consumers around the world becoming better and better informed about the environmental and, importantly, health impacts of what they're eating, the transition to a more sustainable food system has finally become possible. Consumers all over the world are rethinking their purchase habits, especially when it comes to food. And this survey shows that 81% of consumers surveyed intend to purchase more environmentally friendly food products after the lockdown. So today we see a strong movement towards healthy eating as a major component of an overall trend towards conscious consumerism. It's not just concerns for the environment, it's this trend towards being more healthy. Studies claim that plant-based diets can prevent and even reverse a whole range of food and lifestyle-borne illnesses, including heart disease and type 2 diabetes. You'll note from the chart on the left here that Americans ate less meat in 2019. And the main reasons cited by consumers for that were concerns about health, although respondents also cited the environment, food safety, and animal welfare as significant factors too. Now, currently, global consumption of meat is on the rise, although there is a divergence between what's going on in developed countries versus developing countries, and between also the different meat types. Meat demand continues to grow as incomes continue to grow in developing countries, and per capita consumption is projected to increase. Conversely, many developed countries have reached saturation in their meat consumption levels. You'll note from the chart on the right that Kearney is predicting that the global meat market could actually undergo a drastic change over the next 20 years. They predict a significant long-term decrease in the global sales of conventionally produced meat and an increase in consumption of vegan meat substitutes and cultured meat. Climate change, obesity, technology advancements, and changing consumer lifestyles, these are going to be hugely influential factors with respect to the longer term per capita consumption of meat and the adoption of plant-based alternatives. These factors influence public policy initiatives and shifts towards environmentally sustainable consumption patterns. Growing consumer consciousness around animal treatment and how meat is produced, as well as concerns for the environment and climate change, are relatively new factors that are anticipated to play a major contributory role in the transition to more plant-based and therefore sustainable diets in the coming years. What is clear is that the consumption of plant-based foods is on the rise, and the forecasts are hugely positive. And here I've just outlined 3 of the companies that we're looking at the moment. 2 of these are in our ETF, Beyond Meat and Burcon Nutriscience. All of them involved in the plant-based space. 2 of them, though, probably lesser known to most investors. Else Nutrition is a little bit small at the moment, hasn't yet made it into our, it's in our investable universe, hasn't yet made it into the fund until it reaches a minimum market cap and liquidity threshold. So here we've laid out one of the subsectors within our fund. The global precision farming and smart agricultural subsector is one of the major areas that we've captured. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this. It's one of the biggest areas of growth in the agricultural subsector of the broader food theme. Precision agriculture is also one of our best performing subsectors in recent months, and Rahul will touch upon that momentarily. Highly sophisticated technology is effectively being introduced into an industry, i.e. the agricultural machinery, which has until now been more focused on enhanced mechanization. This is resulting in high value control systems and technology and data being incorporated into harvesters, sprayers, and planters in the field, i.e. farming is going big tech. There's no better example of this than John Deere. the company that everyone associates with big green and yellow tractors that we all wanted to ride around on as kids. In 2017, John Deere purchased a company called Blue River Technologies, a robotics and automation tech company. Since then, they've been working to incorporate Blue River's see and spray technology across all of their machinery. The see and spray technology uses machine learning to detect and treat weeds and pests in the field on a plant by plant basis. So that tractor is running down the field and it is assessing each plant in the row to figure out what does it need and gives it exactly what it needs. It's an example of the latest iteration of precision agriculture, where a machine has a camera installed that detects every plant in the field within 50 milliseconds before providing plant by plant care. According to Blue River, the see and spray technology allows farmers to use 90% less herbicide in the field while working with better precision, thus giving them the tools to do more with less. Very soon, the sight of a crop dusting biplane will be a thing of the past. Here, I've just highlighted some of the stats on in terms of the projected growth of vertical farming. This is a major trend. We capture it within our precision farming subsector at the moment. App Harvest, they recently did a SPAC, and Aero Farms, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they've also just announced that they are going to be doing a SPAC. Aero Farms is one of the highest profile vertical farm outfits in the world, and doing some really fantastic things in terms of rolling out their technology. Another area that we're focused on is packaging. So we're seeing this trend around the world at the moment for single-use plastic packaging in particular to be being phased out. It's being banned in many countries. Plastic bags was the first. And so we've aimed to capture that in our sustainable packaging subsector, where we really only capture companies that are providing recyclable or compostable packaging or reusable packaging. So I'm just going to pass over to Rahul now, who's going to introduce you to our ETF and some of the key features of the ETF.
Great, thanks for that, Stuart. And so the next section is on our fund, and just by way of intro, what we've done with our fund is we have built an investment strategy that broadly seeks to capture the companies that are helping accelerate the transition, the food transition that Stu talked about, towards a more sustainable production and consumption system for food. Now, one of the tremendous benefits that comes with that transition are clear. We get to protect our nature and ecosystems, crucially our biodiversity. Forests remain nature's best technology to absorb carbon from the air. And on the consumption side, we've got a number of different benefits. We get to promote transparency, achieve better nutrition. More of us are now much more conscious around the food we eat, the safety and as well as the provenance of what we're putting in our bodies, especially after the COVID pandemic. I would say that each and every person who's dialed in today is probably a lot more conscious around their purchasing decisions. And the end objective, of course, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are raising the temperature of our planet, as well as protecting the biodiversity that's left. And so what we've tried to do is build a fund that's able to identify the key areas of change, of growth, if you will, and basically use an ETF to target the companies that are enabling that transition. And there's a number of different components to this, and I think I'll start with an overview of our partner. And for this fund, we actually, as we do for all of our funds here at Rize, we look for sector specialists in each of the relevant themes that we're building a fund on, and we essentially partner with them to devise a let's call it an investing classification or taxonomy for the relevant theme we're trying to track. In the case of food, we partner with a group out in the US. They're called Thematica Research, and we've effectively did a bit of a beauty contest. We met a number of different firms, and we basically looked into their capabilities in terms of breaking down a complex theme like sustainable food into investable, digestible, understandable areas of investability and growth. So that process led us to these guys. And one of the things that they do particularly well is they're able to thematically score companies that are exposed to the relevant themes. So you can see there on the top right, we've got a purity score, as well as a percent revenue exposure that is a reflection of that score. So companies with a higher score derive greater revenues from the theme, and companies with lower scores derive lower revenues from the theme. And this is important in a theme like food, because you have this kind of this two-part dynamic. You've got a lot of pure play companies, and companies that Stu mentioned, like AppHarvest, Beyond Meat, Else Nutrition, Atlantic Sapphire. These can be broadly categorized as pure play companies. But on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the sort of names that you probably have heard of, but aren't particularly too familiar with what they've been doing over the last 5 to 10 years, which is basically trying to adapt to this food transition and investing in technologies, investing in science to clean up their act effectively. I mean, this is very much a key component of this. The regulatory and the political drivers and tailwinds are too strong to ignore, and of course the sort of consumer push as well. And these companies are effectively cleaning up their act, and you want to be able to have a methodology that's able to capture companies that really are moving towards more sustainable production and transport and distribution systems. So all the stuff that happens before we actually get to the food and eat and eat what's coming out from the production side. So really the partnership with Thematica was to try to effectively map that, create a taxonomy for that. And what that resulted in was a taxonomy that looks like, and we can see it on the following slide, effectively 9 subsectors of innovation within the food ecosystem. Stu touched upon a few of these, but at a high level, these are the areas that we've identified. The great thing about having a partnership with a group like Thematica is that this classification can evolve over time, right? So we might have 9 subsectors today, but that doesn't mean that we can't have 10, 11, or 12, down the line. And so the idea would be, these are the areas that are clearly and distinctly identifiable today, but there obviously could be some interesting areas to look at as we move forward, and we can dissect the sub themes a little bit further on the next slide as well. And here, what we effectively have is some of the sustainability features of each of our subsectors, but also as a result, the sustainability features that exist within our fund. And here we can think about, when you build a fund like this, there's obviously a number of considerations, and here's just a sampling of our considerations in our fund. The first one is, of course, that we need to drastically reduce our consumption of land-reared meats, right? There's really no way around that at this point. So in our food, or in a plant-based food subsector, we're investing in companies that are innovating in plant-based and organic themes. However, we exclude companies that produce products derived from land-reared meats, such as beef, lamb, pork, poultry, as evidenced by their product sets and public disclosures. So, for example, you've got Tyson Foods. They're a big investor in the alternative protein market. However, it's the world's second largest meat producer. And you go on their website, they'll make a big song and dance around alternative proteins, but when you look into the public disclosures, they're still deriving most of the revenues from beef, right? So it's this kind of company by company level due diligence that's needed to really understand, who are the companies that are truly committed, right? Not just the companies that are paying lip service to the theme. And given its meat exposure, and continuing the example of Tyson Foods, the negative impacts of which we've talked about extensively on this webinar, we don't believe that Tyson is contributing towards a sustainable future of food. And accordingly, we decided to exclude companies, including Tyson and others, from our plant-based foods subsector. So some of the other things we look at, we believe that there's a need to move towards more sustainable packaging options. These are packaging options that are inherently reusable, recyclable, and compostable. So our sustainable packaging subsector is designed to capture companies engaged in the production of food packaging that's both sustainable and either reusable, recyclable, or compostable. We also believe that there's a need to focus on bio-based stimulants and crop protection products. So effectively, we need to transition away from the production of nitrogen, phosphate, and/or potassium-based fertilizers. I mean, these fertilizers were invented, in the 1940s in Germany under a not particularly friendly dictator, and and subsequently to World War II, they basically took these poisons effectively, and they started using them in the US across the entire agricultural ecosystem. And I think what's happened is, the soils are destroyed in many parts of the world as a result. And so we need to basically bring these soils back to life. The dirt needs to be given another lease of life and be turned back into soil. And so we need to effectively move away from these chemical fertilizers, because they're just making they're destroying land, and we're narrowing the surface of the planet where we can actually grow food, and that's not a particularly smart thing to be doing when we're going to have 2 billion more people by 2050. So we need to move towards bio-based stimulants that will have more favorable environmental outcomes. And finally, we also need reporting standards around this, right? So companies need to be willing to engage. Glossy green marketing simply isn't good enough. Companies need to be willing to talk to you, answer questions like, how are you managing your forest risk commodity exposure? In this regard, we actually work with CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, to determine whether companies in the relevant subsectors of the universe are sustainably managing their FRC exposure within their supply chains. And on the next slide, we can actually see the most prevalent FRCs relating to the food system. So you've got palm oil, soy, cattle, timber. And in developing the taxonomy for a sustainable future food theme, we were actually looking for the companies involved in plant-based foods, ingredients, and fiber-based packaging. And we noticed a number of companies that had exposure to these 4 FRCs within their supply chains. And these 4 are the most damaging of the FRCs in global food supply chains, and are also the leading cause of deforestation, as Stu mentioned, in the most biodiverse places on Earth, like the Amazon or the Borneo. So accordingly, it was essential that we establish a mechanism whereby we could ultimately snip out these companies because they weren't procuring FRCs in a sustainable and transparent as well, which is a huge issue, a transparent way. So the problem is that every company is investing heavily in green marketing and sustainability reports, and it makes it really difficult to assess which companies are actually managing their FRCs in a sustainable way. And what we've recognized in building this product is that this whole idea around self-certification, it doesn't work. It's anyone that relies on self-certification, is not doing it correctly. And so we can't trust what the company says, because the fact is that deforestation is getting worse while all the companies are telling us that they're getting better. So the only way to assess whether a company is managing FRCs is is to really for the assessment to be conducted in an independent and an objective way via a open framework where companies submit to independent reviews of their activities and can ultimately be benchmarked against their peers. So make it a competitive process. And CDP or the Carbon Disclosure Project, as they're better known, are effectively the leading not-for-profit organization specializing in these types of independent reviews. And they've added deforestation recently to the work they do. And the work that we've been doing with them is actually, we managed to achieve the title of Forest Champion because we've managed to compel certain companies to start engaging with their process. But this is we're just scratching the surface in terms of how much needs to be done here. And anyone that's listening to this call, if you are engaging with companies, if you are trying to compel them to better their disclosures, their public disclosures, and be more transparent around their supply chains and their FRCs, get in touch with us. We'd love to learn from you. I mean, and we're happy to share, what we've, the results of what we've been doing as well. But I think, this really needs collective action. One asset manager in London is not going to achieve the result that we need. Every asset manager on the planet needs to be doing this, and investors in funds need to be holding these companies to account as well. So to finish up on this slide, companies are assessed in relation to each FRCs that they have exposure to respectively. And so what this effectively results in is an exclusion list, which we see on the next slide, which we've developed with the work we're doing with CDP, which has a number of companies on it now. You can see the companies that were added in July. You can see the companies that were added this year. But companies are placed effectively on the Rize Future First exclusion list, which is what we call it, if having participated in CDP's independent review, they receive a poor score from CDP, or simply if they refuse to participate. So if they refuse to participate or cooperate, they're out. And at the moment, there are several companies that we've excluded because they've refused to participate in the process. Some of these have actually surprised investors. I'm sure you're looking at some of the names there thinking, why is this company on an exclusion list? Because they're so accustomed to seeing, high degrees of green marketing from these companies. Our view is that if a company is doing everything that they say in their marketing, then they should have no problem engaging. It's as simple as that. It's not a complex decision. It's as simple as, if you're refusing to engage, chances are you've got something to hide. And so on the next slide is an overview of how we actually build the investment strategy. So again, this is an ETF, it replicates an index. And so what we've described here is how the index is constructed. So Thematica Research, as I mentioned earlier, they're in charge of dynamically managing the stock universe that sits above the index. They are maintaining a subsector classification as well as companies within each of those subsectors by reference to a definition of the sustainable future of food, which has been effectively jointly agreed. And that definition, as I mentioned, excludes land-reared meats. It excludes companies exposed to GMO seeds. We focus on companies with packaging companies that are producing reusable, recyclable, and or compostable packaging. And that's a universe. You can think of it as a list of companies that's being dynamically managed over time. It's refreshed constantly every 6 months. If you have new IPOs, if you have some spin outs, that kind of thing. But for the most part, this is something that's in most cases growing over time, because we expect many more sustainable food companies to list on public markets in the years ahead. There's a lot happening in the private space, which is also something we monitor quite a lot, trying to basically identify the next companies that are going to be potentially members of our ETF. And the second part of what Thematica is doing is scoring these companies. So I mentioned this earlier, companies get a score of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based on their thematic purity or revenue purity. however you like to think of it. And what we're doing for our investment strategies, we're excluding out companies that score less than 2 on that revenue purity. The third step is obviously the market cap and the liquidity screens, which you typically have with any ETF. And then what I talked about, in the last couple of slides, which was the CDP part, identifying companies with bad FRC risks and excluding those effectively. Now, what's interesting here is I mentioned cattle in that list, but you can see already in step 1 there, no companies producing land-reared meats. Cattle companies are already excluded at that stage. So although it's listed there, it's a little bit of a redundant exercise because by the time we get to step 4, the future first exclusion list, there are no meat companies in the basket anyway. So you basically get rid of those guys. And then in step 5, you have a weighting process. And the way we decide to do our weighting is we actually weight companies by reference to their purity to the theme. So if a company has significant exposure to a particular subsector, it's going to get a bigger weight in the fund. And if a company has a low exposure to a particular subsector, they're going to get a lower weight. We prefer this approach to the traditional equal weighted approaches which exist in many thematic funds. The reason is simple. We believe that every thematic fund's key objective should be to maximize revenue exposure to a particular theme. Where you start diluting it over time, it stops being a thematic fund. And so we really take that seriously. And in all of our products, if you were to look at the index methodologies, you'll see that there's a very strong consideration in all but one case. And we can talk offline of what that product is. It's the medical cannabis product. But in all but one case, there's a very significant focus on the revenue purity of each company, as well as using that, leveraging that score, that revenue purity score, to assign effectively weights to the companies. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's an ETF. So we've got a wholly systematic, custom-built investment strategy. It's then indexed, right? So you take this systematic rules-based investment strategy developed with Thematica, you index it, and then what you do is you create an ETF and you say, okay, this ETF is going to replicate this index. And so that's what we're doing in the final stage there. The index itself is rebalanced in March and September. And one of the questions that's actually come in is, do companies come in and out of, do companies have the chance to come in and out of the exclusion list? The answer is the exclusion list is reviewed every 6 months. We also obviously have Thematica refreshing the universe every 6 months. So this is a dynamic process. So you will see, in most cases, you're likely to see changes to the portfolio in March and September. We rebalance the third Friday of March and September. So if you were to look at it, the Monday thereafter, in any of those months, you're likely to see some stock additions, some defaulting back to index weights, et cetera, et cetera. But normally that's how indices work, and this is no different. And so if we go to the next slide, here is just a sampling of a couple of the companies in our fund. So Beyond Meat, we obviously, nobody would expect that company not to be in a fund like this. We also got a number of precision farming names like Agco and Deere. Stu spent some time talking about what some of the interesting stuff that's going on in precision farming. Atlantic Sapphire is a really interesting one. It's a company that actually came into our index at the rebalance this month. So on the third Friday of March, this company came in. And for those of you who don't know, Atlantic Sapphire are the largest global onshore aquaculture company in the world. The company has really strong social environmental credentials and is rapidly expanding its operations in the US and Europe. They've got something called a blue house technology. And someone asked the other day, what's a blue house? And basically it's a greenhouse for fish. And Atlantic Sapphire have two. They've got one in Florida and one in Denmark. And the idea is that you have a controlled environment, right? So you're able to use zero antibiotics and hormones, achieve 100% parasite-free environment. You have lower fish water ratios. You can also use recycled water. Atlantic Sapphire has actually managed to achieve a 99% recycled water usage, which is pretty incredible. Another company that came into our index in March is Yukiguni. So it's a Japanese company, and these guys are essentially an edible fungi company, right? These guys cultivate and process maitake, which is type of if you've had mushrooms in Japanese restaurants, you might have had some of these, but it's like a meat-like mushroom with a pretty strong umami flavor. And these guys are using, again, an all-natural, pesticide-free, chemical-free process. They're leveraging technology in a controlled environment to produce the mushrooms they produce. One of the more interesting things about Yukiguni is that they've actually recently partnered with a Japanese robotics firm to develop a automation technology that enables them to farm more smartly and improve yields, while, and this is the objective, generating much less waste in their facilities. So the waste part is crucial. According to the UN, a third of the food on the planet is wasted. So here's a company that's really doing some interesting things. We thought it was worth considering, so it's made its way into our fund. And if we go to the next slide, here is an overview of the portfolio characteristics. So if you're new to the product, if you've never seen this slide before, you will notice a couple of things immediately. We're pretty well diversified across the 9 subsectors that we covered earlier. We've got a pretty good diversification in terms of countries. What you'll find with most thematic funds is that they'll have 70-80% exposure to US names. One of the things that clients so far have really liked about this fund is its less US bias, let's say. It's still pretty high exposure to the US, but it's comparatively less when looking at it versus a lot of the other thematic funds. And so people have liked that diversification in terms of geography. Another aspect that a lot of investors have liked in this fund is the market cap exposure. So pretty well diversified across the caps. A lot of thematic funds, when you really start to unpack them, you'll notice will have a lot of small and mid cap exposure. And sometimes you will see those portfolios flying around quite sharply. And I think what you want with a thematic fund is not something with a annualized volatility of 45%. You kind of want something that's a little bit not necessarily the MSCI World, but you want something that's probably right in the middle there. That's what you're typically looking for. You're trying to access a portfolio of growth names, right? So you kind of but at the same time you don't want to have 45% drawdowns, right? And so I think you basically have to find that nice balance, and this is a theme that kind of finds that nice balance for you, right? And the large cap exposure is, we feel, quite important to dampen that and soften the blows when times are tough. We can also look at this from a GIC sector overview. So we've got a fund here that actually touches 6 different GIC sectors. I haven't seen that in many thematic funds. Normally you will have information tech being 100%. Other times you will have healthcare being 100%. The really interesting thing about this product is it really does touch, a number of different GIC sectors. These numbers are actually moving around quite a bit as well, as companies come in and out of the fund. But it's a really interesting dynamic to monitor. And of course, this is because, we are looking at the entire value chain of food. We are looking at all the stuff that's on the production side, everything in the middle, and then everything that's on the consumption side. So you've got consumer, you've got materials with a packaging company, you've got staples, even some healthcare names. Of course, you can't get away from information technology, but it's significantly lower than what you will find in the majority of thematic funds, and of course industrials. You can't escape that, right? So it's a really interesting one in terms of GICs, and top 5 companies as well. You can see the top 5 holdings right there. This is basically post rebalance, sorry, and you can see that roughly most companies in the fund have a sort of 2 to 4% weight. at any given moment in time. So that's roughly how you should think of it. We've got 45 companies in the basket at the moment, so every company with a 2 to 4% weighting, you get a pretty well diversified basket. Revenue purity, we talked about this, the scoring that Thematica does. If you look at it as an average across the basket, we've got a figure of 72%. And if we go to the next slide, we can actually see the performance of the strategy over the last 5 years. Obviously it's a big period. And it's hard to make out, the very specific details here, but some numbers on the right that you can see. For Q1, we basically delivered 8% on the fund. The biggest contributors to performance on the next slide were Eugelina, Agco, Valmont Industries, and Lindsay Corp. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. You can see here that what the best performing companies were as well. We've got Ardagh, we've got Deere, Agco, Valmont, and Lindsay. So effectively, what you have on the best performing side, we had 30 out of the total 45 companies that delivered positive performance for the quarter. Broadly speaking, they held an average cumulative weight of around 71% of the index for the quarter. And then on the right hand side, we can see the worst performing companies. Sorry, the chart is not the best here, so I apologize for that. But and we can send this in a bigger version, so the text is easier to make out. But the worst performers effectively for the quarter were Ocado, Ball Corp, Mission Produce, Tomra, and one more company. Yeah. So. And finally, we can go on the next slide and we can actually look at the subsectors as well. So how have the subsectors done in the last quarter? The best performing subsectors are pretty easy to make out. We've got water, technology, and precision farming. But then there were some other sectors that delivered pretty reasonable numbers. We saw IFF, which is ingredients, flavors, and fragrances, did around 9.3%. We saw supply chain tech, which did 5.9%. We saw sustainable packaging, which did 9.8%. Plant-based foods did 6.5%. Food safety did 5.5%. And then there was some negative performance. Agri-science, for example, did minus 5.5. But what you see there is this little thin blue line. If you can see, it goes a little further than the others. That's the index. And so you effectively have some more data for the index, so that's why you can make it out. But yeah, that's the index, which is of course an aggregate of the 9 subsectors. And if we go to the next slide, here's just an overview for those who aren't familiar with these details yet. We obviously have roughly 150 million. It's a little higher, I think, at the moment than 143. I think we're at sort of 146, 147 at the moment. The fund carries an OCF of 45 basis points. It's the base currency is dollars. You'll see the ICE in there if that's what you're searching for to find the fund. And then all the other stuff I mentioned, the index name, as well as the thematic classification. If you want to get an understanding of what Thematica research are doing, I would highly encourage all participants to look at the classification methodology, which is on our website. So if you go to the fund page on our website, you'll be able to download the classification methodology. It's separate to the index methodology. So read both of them. If you're looking into this fund and you want to understand what's going on, read both of those documents. Start with the classification, then look at the index methodology, and you'll get a pretty good sense of what's going on. Of course, we're also happy to share these slides so you can look at that. And then, of course, physically replicating fund. We're listed across 5 exchanges in Europe. And you can also see the registered countries, for those of you who are working for groups that, have a pan-European presence. Sometimes it's important to be registered in multiple markets. And so those are the markets. Portugal is still pending, but we expect that to be live in the next week or so. And the next slide is basically an overview of our liquidity ecosystem. So here are market participants. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's the liquidity ecosystem. So we've got the APs and the market makers. If you have any questions, just shoot us an email on primarymarket@rizeetf.com. and somebody will in our capital markets team will pick it up, most likely Anthony. So if you want to understand why spreads aren't as perhaps tight as they should be, or how to best execute the fund, how you should execute depending on the size that you're doing, yeah, just shoot us an email. We're always happy to jump on a call and then basically provide our color. And I think that brings us to the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you, Stu, for your presentation. We've got some time now for the Q&A, and I'd like to just remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, you can just type it into the Q&A panel, and we will address it. And if you have any issue submitting a question, raise your hand and I will be in touch. I'm also just going to share a poll with you guys, so you can answer and then let us know a bit of feedback regarding the webinar, and then we'll take the first question right away. The first question, I think, is going to be for you, Stu, and it's someone is asking regarding the recent SFDR and which SFDR classification does this fund have?
So this fund is a Article 9. It's and there's two reasons. We've talked about how the fund is structured. So in the first instance, we've created a sustainable future of food classification system. So it's been specifically designed to effectively provide exposure to that transition to a sustainable food system, right? So for example, we include the plant-based food sector, but within that we say no meat companies, because the inclusion of exposure to things like beef are entirely inconsistent with a transition to a sustainable food system. So everybody has their own views on that, but the facts are the facts in terms of the emissions and the deforestation, the other environmental damage that comes from that particular industry. So that's just an example of how we have constructed that sustainable future of food taxonomy, again specifically designed to help facilitate that transition. Now, what SFDR requires is that okay, you might have a sustainable objective, but you need to also make sure that you're not doing sort of other damage, right, in the process, right? So what other things do you do to take into account companies that might, in the first instance, be aligned to your sustainable objective, but might be doing some other harm? And deforestation is one of the big ones that we identified in that process. And that's why we have the Rize Future First exclusion list, and we do all this work with CDP to snip out companies that, yeah, they might be aligned to plant-based foods, they might be really innovating there, but they might be using soy, right? They might be procuring soy and using that in their products, and they might not be procuring sustainable soy, sustainably produced soy. So we need to make sure that companies do not, or the companies that we include, are submitting to CDP's annual independent review process, and therefore can be objectively benchmarked against their peers and assessed for sustainability practices. And that's why, for example, you'll see companies getting stuck on our exclusion list, which is dynamic. It's reviewed every few months. And it's exactly why certain companies will be excluded if they subsequently either fail to participate in CDP's forest risk questionnaire process and review process, or if they just score badly, right? So we've seen that recently. Vitasoy were one of our constituents, and we had to exclude them at the recent rebalance because they scored horrifically for soy, and that is the very industry that they're in, right? They're creating soy-based products, and to score with a D in soy is just it's totally incompatible with what we're trying to achieve with our fund. And because of SFDR, it's an obligation on us that notwithstanding what our intention might be, we need to be making sure that we are looking at this holistically and excluding companies that are not being transparent or not managing things in a sustainable manner.
Thank you, Stu, for answering this question. There's another question that's come up, and I think this one is going to be again for you, Stu. Someone is asking if we think that we might add on to the 9 current subsectors that we have within the fund. Are these likely to expand or even maybe reduce in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I sort of covered at the beginning, you know, this is a transition, right? Just like in the energy space, we have a transition to renewables, which is going to take time. You know, within that space, you're going to have new technologies that are going to come to the market. Right now, there might be a lot of startups, there might be a lot of research going on, but they might not yet be investable. The same is the case. The same is the case in the food space. We expect there to be a lot of innovation over the coming months. I mean, you just need to take a look at what's going on in the VC space, the private side, and there's a new cellular meat startup every other day. There's a new vertical farming startup every other day. Extremely exciting stuff, and we're really only just starting to see these things in pure play format, like rolling out into the public market. So, you know, we expect this fund and the taxonomy that we've developed with Tematica to really evolve over the coming months and years. And we'll be breaking things out, right? So precision farming at the moment would capture vertical farming. Again, you know, the 2 companies that I highlighted earlier, we expect them to be coming into our index and our fund over the coming months as they become of sufficient market cap and liquidity to be eligible for inclusion, because we cannot include companies that are too small or too illiquid. But once these companies start to come in, you know, we may in a year or 2 actually create a breakout subsector of vertical farming. So the whole idea of having an index that has been bespoke built in combination with a thematic research house is that it's able to evolve over time. And that's exactly what the intention is with this product.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, I think we were seeing some really interesting stuff in the VC space. You know, we were speaking with somebody in the food in the sustainable food space last week who was a VC, and he was basically telling me about his favorite company, which is a company called Geltor. Not everyone is aware of this, but lipstick, for example, has pig's gelatin in it, and we all know that we all know the expression, you know, putting lipstick on a pig, right? When in fact that we've forever been putting pigs on our lips. But what Geltor are doing is they're effectively using this some sort of synthetic biology to bioferment collagen, and are changing the market. So some really interesting stuff there. Was also mentioned this other company called The Perfect Day, and what they're doing is they're creating ice cream without using a cow. And this is really interesting. You know, you got these sort of recombinant companies that are biofermenting proteins in the same way as, you know, you take yeast in the process to make beer. You know, why would you not brew milk why would you still need to brew milk in the cow, you know, when you can brew exactly the same milk in a brewery? So Perfect Day was also one company that she mentioned, but that was really interesting for me. But yeah, there's so much interesting stuff going on. If you're interested in cultivated meat, you know, I'd encourage you to look up this company in the US called Memphis Meats. They're one of the leaders in that space. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, you know, and with mushrooms to algae, you know, companies trying to copy nature's structures to create ingredients or whole products, you know, even that through things like biomimicry. But synthetic biology is probably, you know, that I think collectively these 3 companies I've just mentioned kind of fall into that bracket, and you know, I think that may become a subsector of its own, because it's just, there's just so much happening there, and all the VCs, the big VCs in the US are really focusing attention on the sustainable food space at the moment. So as Stu said, you know, we expect a lot more IPOs.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you, Stu. Raul, I think I've got a question here for you. someone is saying that they are investing into climate products at the moment, and they're asking if we think that this ETF will work well alongside these types of products.
So the question is, would this fund work well alongside other thematic ETFs? Is that right?
More alongside climate products.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would say the answer would depend on what else you hold. There's definitely a lot of funds out there that are sort of broad, let's say, climate products that will capture all the key areas of decarbonization. So from energy efficiency, food and agriculture, even things, companies, funds that look at decarbonization of steel and cement, which are not often talked about, but are crucially important. So there will be a lot of products out there that will be all-encompassing products. We feel like a lot of those products probably won't do the same level of due diligence on each of the individual areas. I think it's much smarter to basically look at the decarbonization story over the next decade, 20 years, however long the time horizon is, and say, okay, well, I'm going to find the best funds for me for each of these individual components. That's the way we would encourage the building of a portfolio like this. In some areas, some people might want to go active. In other areas, people are perhaps more happy to go passive. Our approach here is really a hybrid. We're taking the research of an independent group as well as our own, and we're packaging all of that inside of an index. And the classification is testament to that. And of course, by doing that, we can offer this fund at a really compelling price point of 45 basis points. Where you look in the active world, you're paying upwards of 100 basis points. And are you getting the value you're looking for? I don't know. Only investors can decide that for themselves. But really, I think the important thing here is, does the features of the product align with your own views, right? And there's enough products out there to really look for the one that best aligns with your own view and make a selection based on that. But that's what we would say, look across the board. Probably the broad products won't do a good enough job, at the sort of rigorous independent subsector level. Look for the best products for each of the areas and pick the one that you think is the most appropriate for you.
Thank you, Raul. The next question is going to be for you, Stu. Actually, there's two similar questions that were asked, and I'm going to just try and formulate it within one. So two people are mentioning about the meat and cattle production and this industry that is currently quite damaging to the environment. The question here is rather than excluding beef and meat, would it be possible in a way to have a sustainable low emission way of producing these, or maybe even reforming this industry rather than just fully excluding it?
It's a very good question. I think it's a really good question, and the reason it is because, yes, can you make the cattle ranching industry, let's focus on that one. Can you make that more efficient in terms of less emissions, less deforestation? Well, the only way you can, there's two different things there, right? Emissions comes from two things. One is the deforestation, and two is the methane that the cows produce themselves. And methane, by the way, is 4 times more virulent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, which is why it's you think, well, just the gas coming out of cows, how can it really be that bad? Well, it's because of the nature of the gas. But to mitigate that, the only way you could do that is by, in the first instance, limiting the space that the cattle are actually, the land that the animals are actually grazing, right? Cattle need a huge amount of land to graze, and we consume so many of them that we therefore need a massive proportion of I guess agricultural land to support them. And as we said, I think it was 70% of agricultural land is used for grazing animals. So the only way that you can get away from that and basically reduce the deforestation, right, is by containing the cattle in intense closed farming methods, right? Is by intense farming practices where you've got them all penned up in very tight space, and obviously that has all kinds of other implications for people, right? So most people are much prefer free range. They are not going to. Are consumers going to start buying beef where it's been farmed in a tightly penned environment? And the answer to that is obviously no. The second thing is on emissions, right? So the only way you can really do something with emissions is by capturing the methane that is produced by the cows. They're a ruminant animal. Unless you create some sort of some genetically modified animal that that is no longer a ruminant animal, you cannot do anything about the other than changing some of the feed that the animals have. You can't fundamentally remove the methane emissions. There are certain feeds that are coming online which reduce the amount of methane that's produced by the cattle, but the fact is you're really not touching the sides in terms of reducing overall the amount of methane emissions coming from cows. So again, the only way you could really contain that methane, and it would be literally attaching a device to the backside of a cow to capture the methane, or again containing the cattle in some kind of enclosed structure to limit both the amount of land they're grazing on, but also to capture the methane emissions. But again, consumers don't like that. Consumers like free range. They don't, I cannot see a climate conscious consumer or a consumer that's concerned about the degradation of the Amazon rainforest being on board with cattle being enclosed in a sort of an enclosed structure effectively. So I actually don't think that's possible. I think where we're seeing the innovation vis-a-vis cattle and beef is actually in the alternatives, right? So plant-based alternatives to meat, and in also cellular meats, right? So where they're actually taking animal cells and growing them effectively and creating actual real meat without all the actual animals themselves.
Thank you, Stu, for this answer. Another question, and I think these are quite direct, I think, for you, Stu, again. Another question that's come up. Someone is asking about the rationale behind excluding GMO seeds from our companies in the universe.
Yeah, so it's another very good question, and I think one of the things that is worth saying is that when we were designing this taxonomy, we had to take stances on certain topics within this broader food theme, because you've got to lay out your stall somewhere, right? So the exclusion of meat, for example, was a major thing that we felt we needed to do, because we just cannot see how a fund that's investing in companies that are producing meat-based products, in particular products derived from cattle, can be consistent with a sustainable future of food, i.e. that transition that we've been talking about. It's just totally incompatible. And you only need to look at the statistics that we've circulated, which are all from United Nations, Oxford University. These are major outfits that are doing the research here. These aren't statistics that have been plucked from some obscure place on the internet. We know that these things are driving the worst of the change. So it's with all that in mind that we've constructed this in the way that we have.
Thank you, Stu. And I think one of the last questions then for today is about how do we define to which sectors each company belong? And there's a few sub-questions, about if we have how do we get the analysis regarding the split of each company distribution by these subsectors, and especially regarding discretion of these companies regarding to these sectoral exposures. So I guess the question here, and I think this will be again for you, Stu, is how do we actually define these subsectors and where these companies fit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so on that, we obviously work with Thematica Research, right? It took us 10 months to design the taxonomy for this theme. And I think, sorry, there was a question there just on GMO as well, GMO seeds, which, so just to maybe just hark back to that last question. On the GMO seeds, when we designed this taxonomy, as I said, we had to set out our stall. One of the areas was in GMO seeds, and we know that GMO has had a huge amount of press over the last, I guess, 15 or so years. In the last few years, it seems to have come off a little bit. And what we decided, because we see different opinions from all of our different clients, right? I mean, it really does vary across the board, what people think. Some people will tell you that, certainly gene editing is absolutely fine in their opinion, because you're snipping out something in a plant that would make that plant susceptible to a particular disease. For example, you've got citrus trees all around the world at the moment suffering from a disease called citrus greening. The only way that's slowly spreading. Florida doesn't, no longer has a citrus industry of note because of citrus greening. And we're going to have to find ways of preserving our industries and preserving some of the crops that we have by snipping out some of the things that make them susceptible to disease, right? That's just, it's an absolute necessity. It's not something that we can decide we don't like in the future. And a lot of people have that view. A lot of other people will say, they don't subscribe to that view at all. And then you'll have some people who will say, okay, we're happy with gene editing, but we're not happy with gene modification. And gene modification is where you're not just snipping out something from a plant or animal's genome, but you're actually introducing foreign DNA from a different species into the genome of that particular plant or whatever. And they don't like that. And so a lot of people, you got to draw the line somewhere. We drew the line at that point. We basically said, look, gene editing, so seeds have been genetically edited, we would include, but companies involved in the genetic modification of seeds, i.e. where they're introducing foreign DNA, we will draw the line there, because at this point, too many of our investors were anti that particular aspect of it. And just in terms of the development of the subsectors and how we do that, that's what we do with Thematica Research. So 10 months to design the taxonomy and to classify the companies in the first instance. Obviously, this is curated on an ongoing basis. But they go out and they look at all the different companies. They assign them to a subsector that we've established. There's 9 of them there. Some companies actually have exposure to more than one subsector, and when that's the case, they actually get an aggregate score based on their exposure to all of the subsectors that are relevant to them, but they will be labeled as being associated with the subsector where they derive the most revenue. So Thematica engaged with all these companies. They will look at the public disclosures primarily for that information, and in some cases they will engage directly with the companies to clarify an exposure if they have to.
Thank you, Stu. So that was the last of the question that we'll address today, and I would like to thank Stuart and Raul for their presentation, as well as all of you for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation slides, as well as the recording of the webinar via email with you shortly. You can expect that within the afternoon or tomorrow or in the next couple of days. If you have any other question, please feel free to either ask directly to your sales representative that will be in touch with you, or you can send them to hello@rizeetf.com. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar, and I'm looking more for the German and Austrian attendees, please send me an email after this webinar and I will get back to you as soon as possible with your certificate of attendance. Again, I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar today. Our next webinar will be at the end of April and we'll touch upon our medical cannabis funds. It will be available shortly for registration. And I would like to wish you a great afternoon and thank you again for attending. Goodbye.